My hand trembled so violently that I almost dropped the phone. There, on the small, cracked screen of the phone, my son Andrew had given me last Christmas, glowed words that seemed written in ice. "You've lived long enough. Leave us alone." Bruna's name was below, like a cruel signature on an emotional death sentence. At 78, after a lifetime dedicated to my family, after so many sacrifices and unconditional love, this was how my daughter-in-law saw me, a burden that needed to be eliminated. My chest tightened, not for the first time due to age, but with a different, deeper pain. It was as if someone had plunged an icy blade directly into my heart. My eyes, already clouded by cataracts, filled with tears I couldn't hold back. The silence of my simple home in the countryside seemed to amplify the echo of those damning words. "You've lived long enough." As if my existence were an overdue bill, a deadline that had expired. I placed the phone on the coffee table, next to the framed photo of me holding Daniel when he was just 2 years old. In that picture, his bright eyes shone as he looked at me with the pure love only a child can express. How did we get here? How did the boy who once ran into my arms, crying because of a scraped knee, now allow his wife to send me such a cruel message? Monday afternoon dragged on slowly outside the living room window. I was alone, as always. Andrew had stopped by on Sunday to drop off some groceries, but our conversation had been brief. He was always rushing, always busy with work, with his own children. I understood, but I still missed the times when he would sit beside me just to talk. Daniel. Well, Daniel barely called. His visits had become increasingly rare, and when they did happen, he seemed impatient, as if he were fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. But let's go back to the beginning, because to understand the cruelty of that message, you need to know the journey that brought me here. I married young, at 19, to Robert, a good man who worked as a mechanic in his family's shop. We were poor, but happy. Our house was small, only 3 rooms, but it was always full of laughter and dreams. Andrew was born when I was 21, and Daniel arrived 3 years later. I remember holding each of them for the first time, feeling that overwhelming love only a mother knows, silently promising that I would do everything to protect them and give them a better life than mine. Robert worked from 7 in the morning to 6 in the evening, and I took care of the boys while doing sewing work from home. My fingers would be raw from running fabric through the Singer sewing machine that had been my mother's, but each stitch was made with love, thinking about the milk I would buy, their school supplies, their medicine when they were sick. At night, after the children were asleep, I would still sweep and mop the floor, prepare the clothes for the next day, and if I had any energy left, I would sit with Robert to plan how to manage our limited resources. The boys grew up surrounded by care. I woke up at 5 in the morning to prepare breakfast, make sure their school clothes were ready, comb their hair, and ensure they had their lunches. When they were sick, I would spend entire nights by their bedsides, taking their temperature, applying compresses, whispering prayers and lullabies. Andrew was always more affectionate, more attached. He helped me with housework and liked to sit beside me while I sewed, telling me about his school friends and his dreams for the future. Daniel was more reserved, more independent, but I loved him with the same intensity. When Andrew turned 15 and Daniel 12, Robert started experiencing chest pains. The diagnosis came as a punch to the gut, serious heart problems. He needed expensive medication and rest, which meant less work and less money. I increased my sewing workload, working until 2 in the morning. My eyes burned, my back ached, but I couldn't stop. I was the one supporting the family now. Robert passed away when Daniel was 16. The heart attack was sudden, devastating. I remember being in the hospital, holding his cold hand as the doctors turned off the machines. At that moment, I felt a part of me die with him. But when I looked at my sons, saw their scared and lost faces, I knew I couldn't give in to grief. They needed me more than ever. Alone with 2 teenagers, I intensified my work even further. I sewed school uniforms, party dresses, and mended clothes. My Singer machine ran almost 20 hours a day. I slept 3-4 hours a night, but always woke up early to make the boys breakfast, always smiled when they came home from school, always had a warm meal waiting for them. Andrew started working part-time to help, but I insisted that their studies were a priority. You're going to have a better life than mine. I would say you'll study, have professions, you won't just depend on your hands to survive. Daniel was a good student, but more rebellious. Sometimes he came home late, sometimes I smelled cigarette smoke on his clothes. When I confronted him, he would explode. You're not my father, stop controlling me. His words hurt, but I swallowed my hurt and continued to care for him with the same dedication. Years passed. Andrew graduated with a degree in business administration and got a good job. Daniel studied physical education and became a teacher. I continued sewing, even with my fingers deformed by arthritis, even with my eyesight increasingly weak. But seeing my sons educated and independent gave me a satisfaction that compensated for all the pain. Andrew married Leticia, a sweet woman who always treated me with affection. They gave me 2 wonderful grandchildren who brightened my life with every visit. Daniel took longer to marry, but when he met Bruna, he seemed to have found his soulmate. She was beautiful, articulate, and had studied marketing. On their honeymoon, I sewed for 3 straight weeks to save up for a contribution to their wedding party. My fingers bled, but I smiled, thinking of my son's happiness. At first, Bruna was polite to me, not as affectionate as Leticia, but respectful. She and Daniel would come for Sunday lunch, and I would prepare his favorite dishes, spending hours in the kitchen to make everything perfect. Bruna would compliment my cooking, but always distantly, as if fulfilling a social obligation. The change started subtly. Visits became less frequent. Daniel started to seem impatient when I told a story or took longer to walk. Bruna began making comments about how old the house was, about how it would be better if I moved somewhere with more modern amenities. Initially, I thought she was worried about my safety, about my advancing age. But as the months passed, the comments became more direct, more cruel. Mrs. Elsa, aren't you afraid of living alone? Wouldn't it be more practical to sell this house and move to a smaller place? Nursing homes these days are very good. Do you know of any? The questions always came with a false smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel never contradicted her. When I tried to change the subject or explain that I was fine, that I wanted to stay in my house, he would just shake his head and say, "Mom, Bruna's right, you should think about it." Those words hurt more than any physical pain I had ever felt. Visits became even rarer. Sometimes 2 months would pass without Daniel showing up. When I called, he was always busy. "Mom, I'll call you back later," but he never did. Bruna answered the phone with an increasingly impatient tone. "Mrs. Elsa, Daniel is working. Daniel is resting. Daniel can't talk right now." I felt increasingly alone. My eyesight worsened, my legs grew weaker, and I began to understand that I was becoming a burden to them. But even so, I kept waiting. I kept believing that the love I had planted for so many years still existed somewhere in my son's heart. Then I received that message. "You've lived long enough. Leave us alone." 14 words that summarized decades of dedication in a cold, calculated dismissal. 14 words that transformed all my maternal love into an overdue bill, a nuisance that needed to be eliminated. I spent the rest of that Monday in silence, looking at the message, trying to find some explanation other than the most obvious. Maybe she sent it by mistake, maybe it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Those words represented exactly what she thought of me. On Tuesday morning, while I was trying to have my coffee, my hands still trembling, I heard a gentle knock at the door. It was a young woman I had never seen before. Brunette, kind eyes, a warm smile. She introduced herself as Marina, 28 years old, a volunteer for a city social project that visited vulnerable elderly people. "May I come in?" she asked, in a sweet voice I hadn't heard in a long time. "I'd like to chat a little, get to know you better." At first, I was suspicious. Who was this young woman? Why did she want to talk to me? But there was something in her eyes, a sincerity that touched me deeply. I let her in, and offered her coffee, which she accepted with a smile. Marina had a special way of listening. She didn't just listen to my words, but seemed to understand the silences, the pauses laden with emotion. I told her about my life, about my sons, about my loneliness. She held my hand as I spoke, and her eyes filled with tears when I mentioned the difficulties I had faced. "You're an extraordinary woman," she said. "You raised 2 sons on your own, worked your whole life, gave love unconditionally. That's heroism, Mrs. Elza." It had been so long since anyone had spoken to me like that. It had been so long since I had felt seen, valued. Tears rolled down my face, but this time they weren't just tears of sadness. Marina came back on Wednesday and the following Thursday. She helped me with small tasks. We talked about books. We discovered we both loved poetry, and gradually I opened up more. It was on her third visit that, unable to contain myself, I showed her Bruna's message. Marina's face completely changed. Kindness gave way to indignation. Her eyes shone in a way I had never seen before. "Mrs. Elza, this is unacceptable. This is elder abuse." I tried to downplay it, as I always did. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe, no. Marina interrupted firmly. "There's no excuse for this. You dedicated your whole life to your sons, and receiving a message like that is an intolerable disrespect." She was so indignant that she started pacing the room, gesturing. "Mrs. Elza, do you know there are laws that protect the elderly? Do you know that what she did could have legal consequences?" I didn't know. I had never thought in legal terms. For me, it was just another emotional wound, another disappointment in a life that had accumulated many. But Marina had a different perspective, and that's when she said something that would change everything. "Mrs. Elza, stories like yours need to be heard. So many people are going through similar situations, feeling discarded, invisible. If more people knew about the strength, dignity, and wisdom that you, our elders, possess, maybe the world would be less cruel." She paused, looking me in the eyes. "You know I have a channel where I share true stories of overcoming adversity, stories that inspire, that make people reflect on what truly matters in life. Your story, Mrs. Elza, is one of those that the world needs to hear. If you allow me, I'd like to share it, not to expose anyone, but to show that our society urgently needs to reassess how it treats its elderly. To that end, I ask those listening to subscribe to the channel, because only then can we bring these reflections to more people, and who knows, touch hearts that also need to awaken to the importance of valuing and respecting those who gave us life." But before anything else, Marina wanted to take more immediate action. Against my will, I pleaded with her not to do anything. She decided to file a complaint with the district attorney's office. "Mrs. Elza, this can't go unpunished. You're not just a victim. You represent thousands of elderly people who suffer in silence." On Friday of that week, everything changed drastically. I had woken up earlier than usual, with a strange feeling in my chest. I got up to go to the bathroom, and in the dark hallway, my right foot caught on the rug I'd placed there years ago to keep the cold floor from chilling me. The fall was violent. I felt my hip crack, and a searing pain shoot up my spine. I lay on the floor for hours, unable to get up, screaming for help that didn't come. It was Marina who found me. She had developed the habit of stopping by my house every morning, just to check if I was okay. When I didn't answer the door, she used the key I had given her, and found me unconscious in the hallway. The hospital was a whirlwind of activity. Exams, x-rays, doctors coming and going from the room. They discovered I had fractured my femur and would need surgery. But more importantly, they discovered I was malnourished, dehydrated, and had dangerously high blood pressure. "How long have you been alone?" asked Dr. Anna, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "When was the last time someone in your family checked on your health?" I couldn't answer. Andrew had stopped by the previous Sunday, but our conversation had been brief. Daniel hadn't shown up in almost 2 months. What happened in the following days at the hospital completely surprised me. Marina had spread the news of my hospitalization, and visits I never expected began to arrive. Mrs. Carmen, my neighbor of 20 years, showed up with a homemade meal and tears in her eyes. "Elza, why didn't you tell me you were in need? I would have helped." Former students I had helped with tutoring decades ago came. Seamstresses who had learned the trade from me came. People came that I didn't even remember anymore, but who kept in their memory some act of kindness I had done in their lives. And then Pedro appeared. Pedro Silva, my first boyfriend, that shy young man who sent me love letters when we were 17. I hadn't seen him in over 50 years, since before my marriage to Robert. Now he was there, at 75, with white hair, wrinkles marking a face that remained familiar, holding a bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers, and he still remembered that. Elsa, he said, and his voice trembled with emotion. I heard about your situation in the local newspaper. I came as soon as I could. I learned that Pedro had married, had been widowed 5 years ago, and had always wondered what had happened to me. I never forgot you, he confessed, holding my hand with the gentleness of someone who doesn't want to break something precious. All these years, I've always wondered if you were happy, if you were okay. Our conversation lasted for hours. We talked about the past, about the paths our lives had taken, about the children we raised, the spouses we lost. It was surreal to be there, in that hospital bed, rediscovering a connection I thought was lost forever. Meanwhile, the story of Bruna's message had spread throughout the town. Marina, keeping her word, had shared my story on her online channel, obviously omitting names and details that could directly identify the people involved. But in a small town like ours, information circulates quickly. The title of the post was impactful. You've lived long enough, the phrase that generated a wave of solidarity. The story touched thousands of people. The comments multiplied. This is unacceptable. How can a daughter-in-law treat her mother-in-law like this? Where are this lady's children? We need to value our elderly more. The repercussion reached the ears of Daniel and Bruna, who were called to give explanations to the district attorney's office. I learned about it through Andrew, who arrived at the hospital visibly shaken. Mom, why didn't you tell me about the message? He asked. And for the first time in years I saw tears in his eyes. Why didn't you tell me you were going through this? I tried to explain that I didn't want to create problems between the siblings, that I hoped things would resolve themselves. But Andrew was inconsolable. I should have noticed. I should have visited more. I should have paid more attention. Leticia, his wife, held my other hand. Mrs. Elsa, from now on this will change. You won't be alone anymore. But the confrontation that would change everything was yet to come. Daniel and Bruna finally showed up at the hospital on Thursday. They didn't come out of concern or love. They came because the situation had spiraled out of their control. District Attorney Regina had requested their presence at the hearing, and now they needed to do some damage control. When Daniel entered the room, I barely recognized him. His eyes were shifty, his face tense. Bruna trailed behind him, wearing an expression that clearly indicated she was being forced to be there. Mom, Daniel said, but his voice sounded mechanical. I heard you were hurt. I tried to smile, as I always did when he arrived. Son, it's so good to see you. I've missed you. Bruna remained standing near the doorway, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Her clothes were expensive, her purse designer. I thought of all the seams I'd sewn to help pay for their wedding, all the Sundays I'd cooked their favorite meals. Mom, Daniel continued, clearly rehearsed, we need to talk about your situation. You can't stay alone in that house anymore. It's dangerous. Son, I know it was an accident, but it's not just the accident. Bruna interrupted sharply. It's everything. You're becoming senile. You can't take care of yourself anymore. This is a problem for everyone. The silence that followed was deafening. Marina, who was sitting beside me, slowly stood up. Peter, who had gone to get coffee, returned at that precise moment and witnessed the entire scene. Problem, Marina repeated, her voice low but charged with indignation. Are you calling Mrs. Elsa a problem? Who are you to interfere? Bruna retorted, this is family business. Family. Peter stepped forward. Family is who cares, who protects, who cherishes. You've turned this extraordinary woman into a burden. You should be ashamed. Daniel finally exploded. You don't know anything. You don't know what it's like to deal with this. She keeps calling, complaining, always needing something. This? Marina pointed to me. You're referring to your mother as this. It was at that moment that the mask completely fell. Bruna, completely losing her composure, yelled, yes, that's right. She's lived long enough. She's done what she had to do. Now she's just a burden and wastes money that could be used for more important things. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hospital noises seemed to stop. Daniel stared at his wife in horror, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had said. Marina began to cry. Peter clenched his fists, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Strength. I sat up in bed, ignoring the pain in my hip, and looked directly into Bruna's eyes. When I spoke, my voice was clear and firm, without the tremor of age or insecurity. You're right, Bruna. I've lived long enough to not accept disrespect. I've lived long enough to not allow someone to turn my love into an obligation. I've lived long enough to not stay silent while someone decides when my life ceases to have value. She tried to interrupt, but I continued. I raised this man. I pointed to Daniel with my hands, with my sweat, with my love. I stayed up nights when he had a fever. I sewed until my fingers bled to pay for his education. I worked until my eyesight weakened so he could have a better life. And now you tell me, I've lived too long. Daniel tried to speak. Mom. I know. My voice came out louder than I expected. Not now. Now you're going to listen to me. You gave me life, Daniel, but I gave you so much more than that. I gave you my years, my dreams, my health. And if today you consider that a burden, then I truly have lived too long for you. I looked at Bruna again. But I haven't lived too long to be happy. I haven't lived too long to be respected. And I definitely haven't lived too long to decide that I don't want you in my life anymore. The transformation was immediate. Daniel began to cry, trying to approach the bed. Mom. Please, I didn't mean, get out, I said firmly. Both of you, get out, and don't come back. Mrs. Elza. Bruna tried one last desperate attempt. You're agitated because of the medication. Get out, I shouted. And this time even the nurses in the hallway looked in our direction. After they left, I collapsed. I cried all the tears I had held back for years. I cried from disappointment, betrayal, loneliness. But I also cried with relief. For the first time in a long time, I had defended myself. I had said no. I had chosen my dignity. Marina hugged me. Peter held my hand. And there, in that hospital room, surrounded by people who truly cared about me, I began to understand that perhaps it wasn't the end, but a new beginning. The hearing at the district attorney's office took place 3 weeks later. I had already been discharged, but I hadn't returned to my old house. The campaign initiated by Marina had generated an impressive mobilization in the town. People I didn't even know had organized to get a house adapted to my needs, with ramps, grab bars, and most importantly, daily assistance. At the hearing, Andrew was by my side. He had publicly assumed not only my physical care, but also the affection I deserved. Doctor, he said to the prosecutor, my mother is a hero. She raised 2 children alone, worked her whole life, never asked for anything but love and respect. If my brother can't see that, the problem is his, not hers. Daniel and Bruna seemed smaller in that room. He had tried to contact me several times after our conversation at the hospital, but I had been firm. I didn't want any more contact. Bruna, in turn, seemed unconvinced by the consequences of her actions. District Attorney Regina was direct. The emotional neglect of the elderly is a crime. Emotional coercion is also a crime. The message you sent, Bruna, constitutes psychological violence against a vulnerable person. The court order was clear. Bruna was issued a restraining order and forbidden from contacting me. Daniel was sentenced to pay child support to help with my care and to perform community service at a nursing home for a year. Perhaps this way, the judge said, he will learn to value the importance of the elderly in our society. Today at 79, I sit in the garden of my new home next to Peter. He comes every day, sometimes bringing poetry books, sometimes just his quiet companionship. We've rediscovered a love we thought we'd lost forever. It's not the passionate love of 17, but something more mature, deeper, built on the understanding that time is precious and should be spent with those who truly matter. Marina remains my official caregiver, but she's become so much more the daughter my heart chose. She helps me write letters to others, going through similar situations, transforming my story into a support platform for vulnerable seniors. Andrew comes every weekend with Leticia and the grandchildren. Our conversations are now different, deeper. He asks for my advice, shares his fears and hopes, and I realize he finally sees me not just as the mother who raised him, but as the wise woman life has made me. Daniel tried to reconnect a few times. He sent letters, asked Andrew to intercede, even tried to visit in person. But I remained firm, not out of malice or revenge, but because I learned that forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean reconciliation. I learned I can wish him well from a distance, without exposing myself to his cruelty again. Bruna's message, which should have been my emotional end, became the beginning of a new life. Those 14 cruel words echoed far beyond our family, sparked discussions, shifted perspectives, and awakened consciences. They transformed into a wake-up call for a society that discards its elderly like worthless objects. I haven't lived too long. I've lived long enough to understand that dignity is non-negotiable. I've lived long enough to discover that true love exists and can be found even when we think it's too late. I've lived long enough to learn that our age doesn't determine our worth, that our physical fragility doesn't negate our emotional strength. Every morning, when I open my eyes and see the sun streaming through my bedroom window, I thank God for being here. Not just alive, but living. Not just existing, but valued, respected, loved. Peter kisses my forehead and whispers, "Good morning, my love," and I smile, knowing there's still so much to live, so much to teach, so much to love. Marina visits every day, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to help with the mail I still receive from people touched by my story. She told me that the video of my account has already been viewed by over 500,000 people, generating thousands of comments from children who called their elderly parents, from grandchildren who visited forgotten grandparents, from a society that finally began to reflect on how it treats those who gave it birth. "Mrs. Elsa," she said to me yesterday, as we watered the flowers Peter planted in the front garden, "you've saved far more lives than you realize. Not just your own." And it's true. I've learned that our pain, when transformed into purpose, can illuminate paths for others. That our story, when told with courage, can awaken dormant consciences. That our resilience, when exercised with dignity, can break cycles of disrespect and abandonment. In the afternoons, as the sun begins to set, I sit on the porch with Peter and watch the neighborhood children play in the street. Some stop to greet me, others bring drawings they made at school. One of them, little 6-year-old Sophia, always asks, "Grandma Elsa, will you tell a story today?" And I do. I tell stories about courageous princesses who faced dragons, about fairies who transformed tears into stars, about kingdoms where the wisdom of the elders was the most valuable treasure. But between the lines of each story, I'm teaching about respect, about love, about the importance of cherishing every stage of life. Peter listens to my stories with the same enchantment as the children. "You've always been a storyteller," he told me last week. "I remember when we were young, you already had this gift of transforming simple situations into something magical. It's strange to think it took me 79 years to discover I still had so much to offer the world. For decades, I defined myself only as a mother, a widow, a seamstress. Now I understand that I am so much more. I am a survivor, a warrior, a source of wisdom, an example of dignity. The house I live in now is always full of life." Andrew brought a rocking chair that belonged to his mother-in-law. Leticia planted an herb garden in the kitchen window. Marina installed a bookshelf with books by great authors I always wanted to read but never had the time. Peter brought a guitar that he plays on Sunday afternoons, strumming melodies that transport me back to our youth. Last week, I received a letter from an 85-year-old woman from Recife. She wrote to me in a shaky but determined hand, "Mrs. Elsa, your story gave me the courage to talk to my children about how abandoned I felt. Today they visit me every week, and my youngest granddaughter now sleeps here on Saturdays. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to demand respect." Letters like this arrive almost daily. Marina helps me answer them all. We created a small online support group for seniors going through situations of family abandonment. I never imagined that at 79 I would be using a computer, participating in video calls, helping people I've never met in person, but who share with me the pain of rejection and the strength of overcoming. Carlos, my geriatrician, always comments on how surprising my physical recovery has been. "Mrs. Elsa, I've seen many patients with similar fractures to yours who never walked properly again. But you're better now than you were before the accident." No, I haven't lived too long. I lived exactly what was necessary to get here, to learn these lessons, to become this woman. I lived enough to understand that our age isn't an excuse to be discarded, but a credential that gives us the authority to demand respect. I lived enough to discover that the end of one cycle can be the beginning of another, even more significant one. And so, on this Sunday afternoon, as the aroma of the cornbread I baked for my grandchildren's visit fills the house, while Peter tunes his guitar in the living room, and Marina organizes the cards that arrived during the week, I understand that my true story is only just beginning. Because no one, ever, has lived too long when they can still love, teach, inspire, and transform. No one has lived too long when they still have stories to tell, hands to extend, hearts to touch. No one has lived too long when they can still be an example of dignity, strength, and hope. I am Elsa, I am 79 years old, and I am only just beginning to truly live.